My name is Fabian Devora, and I was at Homeboy Industries for approximately 10 years. I was a kid who was encountered with lots of trauma because we were in these housing projects where it was gang infested. Eventually, I too got sucked into the vacuum that exists within our communities, in this case, gang subculture. I would see Father Greg when he first came to the housing projects to do his missionary work. And I remember what Father Greg said. He said, "The minute you deal with your drug problem, I will give you a stepping stone to get your life back on track." I received the acknowledgement and the recognition of who I am as an individual and as a person, but most importantly, Father Greg saw my gift. This gift was art. I never lost sight of that gift. By looking around the office and coming in contact with the homeboys and homegirls, being reminded of the struggle and the challenges and adversities that this population has to carry, then I say, how can I utilize my art as to paint these beautiful pictures to really tell that story, where the homeboy and homegirl can find themselves and reflect from this beautiful work of art. Oh man, art to me is not just the painting, it's not just the technique, you know. Art is personal. Art is something that continues to define me as an individual, as a person. Art has allowed me to open doors and tap into arenas and spaces and people's lives in such a way that probably another form of therapy would not allow me to. And my main focus now is youth, and I work in the camps, the juvenile halls. I also work with ACTA, which is Alliance of California Traditional Arts. I work in Tehachapi State Prison, level 4. I bring arts there for transformation and healing to the lifers. And most importantly, I still have the space in East LA, which allows me to open the door to utilize the arts for healing and transformation. Art is what has sustained me to this day. It's an antidote and it's medicine that has allowed me to reconvene community efforts. I'm thankful to the homeboys and homegirls who make the place and the staff who are always ready to embrace people like myself.
Hello, thank you for joining us for Stillpoint Speaker Series featuring Father Greg Boyle. I'm Shauna Walsh, and I'm the director of Stillpoint here in Las Vegas. As I look at our list of who's joining us today, I see we have people from California, from Michigan, from Florida, all the way to Ireland. Thank you, wherever you are today. Thank you for being here. We began today with Fabian's video for a good reason. Fabian, as you saw, is a homeboy and an artist. Father Greg once told Fabian, "You got glow." And that glow is that inner light we were all given, but that can be dampened, that can be turned down. In Fabian's case, the tenderness, the compassion, the kinship, the work that he was given with Homeboy Industries amped his light up. In preparation for today's event, we showed this event or this video to the students of Cristo Rey, St. Viator, and CORE, 2 programs that help underserved youth today through education, empowerment, and in turn, the art you see today, before the event started, in the midst of the event, and again at the end of the event, were created by these students. Thank you for sharing your glow. It's so difficult to be a teen today. And so I'd like to invite everybody, wherever you are watching this, please, let's give these kids a glowing applause. So now today's speaker event is a tradition for Stillpoint. We've hosted spiritual powerhouses from Richard Rohr to Brian Swim, Sister Joan Chittister, the Interfaith Amigos, to name a few. Stillpoint, as a center here in Las Vegas, is hospitable to and nourishing in the spiritual life. It's a serene place amid the chaos of daily life, where people can come for respite, for renewal, for programs and services that support spiritual growth, personal development, and social transformation. It was envisioned by Dr. Roisin O'Loughlin, hard for me to say on video. Thank you, Roisin. One of the things I wanted to share is this is not our first time having Father Greg with us. Last year, just before the world shut down, he joined us at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Now our world is reopening, and he's inviting us to rejoin that world with a focus on compassion, with an attentiveness to others, to our own needs, to their needs, and particularly to the needs of those on the margins. With that in mind, I'd like to thank a few people. First, I'd like to thank the organizations that help spread the word from today. Whether you're from Noah's Animal House, whether you're from the St. Rose Dominican Health Foundation, Catholic Worker, No Hero and Heroine, the CORE program, any of the programs here today, thank you. Second, I'd like to thank our co-founders, Delise Sartini, Mary Alice Nielsen, as well as our board of trustees, our staff, our volunteers, and all the friends of Stillpoint who help our not-for-profit mission. Thank you. To everyone here that reached out and made a donation to this, which was a free event today, thank you. And finally, I'd like to thank our major sponsor today, Compassionate Las Vegas. Compassionate Las Vegas is working to make Southern Nevada a more equitable, kind, and compassionate community. Thank you all. Next, I'd like to invite to the screen with me, and then I will leave, or I may leave before, not sure, a few people from Cristo Rey to offer our blessing. Those people include Lelaine Abrego, she's a student. Then we have Brother Rob Robertson and Brother Peter Lamech. Directly after that, we'll head into our talk with Father Greg Boyle, the homie, the best-selling author, the man who recently helped Homeboys win the Conrad N. Hilton Humanitarian Prize Award, and someone that I think of as simply a not-so-secret agent of God, someone who's here to let us know what we are called to, how we are called to compassion in this time. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that introduction. Hello, my name is Lelaine Abrego, and I am a sophomore at Cristo Rey St. Viator, a college preparatory high school in North Las Vegas. My school offers a great education and a work-study program. By partnering with organizations like Stillpoint, I learned skills for success in college, work, and career life. So thank you for being here, for listening. We would like to offer a blessing to begin our time together. Joining us is Cristo Rey's religious teacher, Brother Peter.
Thank you. If you would, take a moment to breathe and soften your gaze as we offer the blessing. Compassion is based on the belief that humanity is united, as we are all children of the one God. Tomorrow is the feast of Pentecost in the Christian tradition. Let us ask God's own Spirit to recreate us anew, so that we might have hearts of compassion for our brothers and sisters in our own community and throughout the world.
Are you ready? Are you ready for me?
Hi, Father Greg.
Hi, say but
Can
the
you
word.
welcome? This is Shauna, and we are all here. Thank you for being with us today, for returning and helping us rejoin a new world.
Okay.
We're going to turn the camera and the time over to you.
Okay.
And when you're done, then we will have time for Q&A.
That's great. Thank you, Shauna. Thank you for your kind invitation. I come to you from Palm Springs, where I spoke at a graduation last night, and was just in San Jose speaking at a Zoom. So now I'm with you guys. So it's an honor to be with you. You know, we're all kind of connected to this vision of wanting to be in the world who God is, compassionate and loving and kind. And so we want to go to the margins and be reflective of the God who is tender. So we receive the tender glance, and then we choose to be that tender glance in the world. We notice the notice of God, and then we become the notice of God. And that's where the joy is. But it happens at the margins, because the idea is, how do we shrink the space that separates us? You know, John writes in his letter, see what love God has, but it needs to be reflective of what people see and in you and in me. And so we go to the margins, because that's the only way they're going to get erased. And we stand there with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless. And we stand with those whose dignity has been denied. And we stand with those whose burdens are more than they can bear. And we feel this extraordinary privilege, you know, to be able to occasionally stand with the easily despised and the readily left out. We stand with the demonized, so that the demonizing will stop, and with the disposable, so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. And we stand there because we want to obliterate once and for all the illusion that we are separate, that there is an us and a them, that you may be one, Jesus says. And so we stand against forgetting that we belong to each other in a community of beloved belonging. The great John Lewis says, we all live in the same house. He didn't say, well, some of us live on the third floor and some of us live in the basement. Nor was it aspirational. One day we all may live in the same house. He says it straight out. We all live in the same house. We stand against forgetting that we belong to each other. This is a difficult undertaking, to be in the world who God is, to be the tender glance for folks. Because in our tribalism and our division and our huge period right now of separation from each other, people will likely accuse us of wasting our time in this effort. But the prophet Jeremiah writes, for in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing. So we go to the margins and other voices get heard. And we try to somehow be that love, see this love, to recognize Christ in the other and in me, and the Christ in me recognizes it in you. And we choose to be enlightened witnesses, people who through your kindness and tenderness and focused, attentive love, return people to themselves. At Homeboy, we're kind of allergic to the notion of holding the bar up and asking folks to measure up, because our God of love doesn't do that. And so why would we? Instead, we're asked to hold the mirror up and return people to themselves. to the truth that they are exactly what God had in mind when God made them. At Homeboy, the homies will say, you know, we're used to being watched, we're not used to being seen. And so we see with the mystical vision, we see the wholeness, and we allow ourselves to be loved into wholeness, and we love others into wholeness, so that my joy may be yours, as Jesus says, and your joy complete. The Buddhists say, oh, nobly born, remember who you really are. And so we're always reminding each other of the truth that you're exactly what God had in mind when God made you. And then you watch folks inhabit that truth and inhabit that nobility and dignity. And then they become that truth more and more, and we all become it. And our hearts have room for others because of it. Meister Eckhart, the theologian and mystic who died, 1200 or something like that, he used to say, it is a lie, any talk of God that doesn't comfort you. And so we've settled for a partial God, I'm afraid. Sometimes we've settled for the God of power, who is on high, who looks down on a sinful world in hopes of saving it. We've settled for that God instead of the God of love, who is right by our side, sustaining us, who doesn't see sin, but sees wound and sees pain and sees brokenness. My friend and mystic, Mirabai Starr, says, once you know the God of love, you fire all the other gods. The petty, exacting, judgmental God. The God who only wants from us and not for us. And so we try to become that tenderness of God in the world. And if we're at the margins, we will observe it and we will see this love. I remember there was a homie named Saul who came into my office one morning, and he was a trainee in our 18-month training program. He had a really hard life. He came home once at 9 years old from school, only to find that his mom had left him. I'm going to presume she was mentally ill. She abandoned her only son, who for quite some time was eating out of dumpsters and homeless, until he joined a gang, and then anyway, found his way to Homeboy Industries, where he began to heal, where he began to transform his pain so he didn't have to inflict it anymore. Well, he came into my office one morning and he said, hey, last night, about 10 o'clock, I was walking home from King Taco to my apartment. And, I passed that little park on Soto. You know the one. And I said, yeah, I didn't, but I didn't want to derail his story. And I saw this old man, and he was on a bench and he was trying to sleep, but he was shivering. And there was an empty 40-ounce bottle of beer by his, just beneath him. And, it was teeth chattering. He was really cold. So, that sweater I love, the one I always wear? I said, yes, I didn't. But again, I didn't want to derail him. I said, of course I do. He goes, well, I took that sweater off and I put it over the man who was asleep or trying to sleep. And then he gets silent and he kind of enters a trance of some kind. And he says, I'm not telling you all this so that you'll think I'm all that. and a bag of chips. No. I'm telling you this because I know that bench. I've been on that bench. And see what love. You know, Jesus says, I won't leave you an orphan. And maybe 45 times in the Old Testament, it talks about the widow and the orphan and the stranger. And our ears and our modern minds don't see it the way they did in those days. The widow and orphan and stranger were seen by society at the time as folks that we can live without you. At Homeboy Industries, we want to look at the widow, orphan, and stranger and say, we refuse to live without you. And we try to shrink the space that exists between us. We receive the tender glance from God, and then we become that extravagant tenderness in the world. We become mystics who see the whole person. And God says, as I have loved you, so must you have a preferential care and love for the widow, orphan, and the stranger, which is to say the folks on the margins, which is to say those who are cut off and left out. And God picks these people for our special preferential care because God thinks these are the folks who know what it's like to have been cut off. And because they've experienced this particular pain, God thinks these are the folks who happen to be our trustworthy guides to lead the rest of us to the kinship of God, to exquisite mutuality, to connection and union, that they may be one, as Jesus says. And so we want to take seriously what Jesus took seriously, which happens to be only 4 things. They're big things, but only 4. Inclusion, nonviolence, unconditional loving kindness, and compassionate acceptance. I was thinking lately that prisons are how we practice exclusion. At Homeboy Industries, we want to practice inclusion. All of us want to create a community of beloved belonging, where people who have experienced profoundly and keenly severed belonging can reattach. Every gang member, man and woman, of the 15,000 who walk through our doors every year come to us with what psychologists call a disorganized attachment. Mom was either frightened or frightening, and you can't calm yourself down if you've never been soothed. And the only thing that can scale the wall of the shame and disgrace behind which they are barricaded is tenderness. If it's true that the traumatized will find their way to damaging people, it's equally true that the cherished will be able to find their way to the joy there is in cherishing themselves and others. And so we cherish each other because we have a God who only longs to comfort us, the God who only wants for us, my joy yours, your joy complete. There was a homie named Gary who came after a long stretch in prison and a difficult and vexing meth addiction. He came to embody his truth and indeed found his true self in loving. He was married, he had 3 daughters. And we were talking one day in my office, and I asked about his childhood, and he said that he was raised by his mom and dad, at least for the first 9 years. But then it got very violent, and his parents were quite drug-addled, and so he was taken from their home. And for 1 year, he was raised by his grandmother until he and his twin brother ran away. They were 9 years old when they went to live with her. And Gary said to me, she was the meanest human being I've ever known. He said that every day after school, every Saturday, and for the entire summer until the 2 of them ran away, she would make them strip down to their chonis, to their underwear, and they'd sit cross-legged in this long hallway, dark and dank. And she would put duct tape over their mouths because she said, I hate the sound of your voices. Then he stops speaking and his eyes well up with tears. And he says, this is why I never shush my girls, because I love the sound of their voices. And when one of my girls takes a crayon and draws this work of art on our wall, and my wife says, tell her something, aren't you going to tell her anything? And I hold my daughter close, and my cheek rests on her cheek, and the 2 of us stare at the artwork. And I tell her, that's the most magnificent piece of art I've ever seen. And once you know the God of love, you fire all the other gods, and you discover the God we actually have, the one who loves the sound of your voice. I knew a homegirl named Nellie who, prison, drug addict, sex trade, had all her kids taken from her. She was a 10 on the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. I stand in awe at what she's had to carry, rather than in judgment at how she's carried it. Once she came into my office, and she was working at Homeboy, and she said, I had a dream last night. And I was in a big old hall, and it was packed with people dancing, and I was dancing with God. And she said, there was a whole line of people trying to cut in. More important people, powerful people, wealthy people. And they all tried to cut in. And God wouldn't let them do it. And we stared at each other with big tears in our eyes at an image of God so perfect. The God who dances with you and doesn't let anybody else in. You know, Homeboy Industries was started a long time ago in 1988 when I was pastor of the poorest parish in the city of Los Angeles, nestled in the middle of 2 public housing projects, the largest grouping of public housing west of the Mississippi. We had 8 gangs at war with each other. The LAPD deemed my parish the place of the highest concentration of gang activity in the world. I buried my first young person killed because of this sadness. And last week I buried my 247th, a young man named Christopher. We did a lot of things. We started a school and a jobs program. finally we started Homeboy Bakery. And it was kind of novel in as much as there wasn't quite anything like it. It announced a message. What if we heal wound rather than punish it? What if we were to invest in people rather than incarcerate our way out of everything? And enemy rival gangs work side by side with each other. And it got a lot of attention, a lot of news crews and tour buses filled with Japanese tourists. And Prince Philip and his business advisors came to visit. And it burned down in October of '99. And, it was natural causes. The wires kind of percolated inside the office and the place imploded. And I remember I was rushing from my house to the bakery and I could see the flames shooting through. And the women in the parish, they were there outside sobbing and hugging me and promising me to have a ventectomia when the sun came up. A young homegirl named Lucero hugged me and she cried and she said, "Don't worry, G, we'll have a car wash," which I was certain would put us over the top. And when I got there, the fire inspector came up to me and he said, you don't have any reason to believe why somebody might have started this fire. I said, no. He said, you didn't have any disgruntled ex-employees, did you? I said, no, I think we're okay there because all the disgruntled ones still work for me. And then he leans in, he's going to confide something in me. This place where the bakery's located, it's known for hoodlums. And I said, well, at Homeboy Industries, I think we're going to be okay because we only hire hoodlums. Well, the sun came up and I was able to inform all our 30 bakers about what happened. Everybody except Danny. I couldn't find Danny, so he shows up and his step is light as he gets off the bus and he's wearing his perfectly ironed white Homeboy Bakery uniform. And he walks into the parking lot and he only goes a few steps when he sees the smoke wafting through the roof. And he sees his coworkers, enemies, rivals, picking through the rubble of the soggy mess that the firefighters pulled out. And he plants his feet and he's kind of semi-paralyzed and he holds his face in his hands and he just begins to weep because this bakery was a whole lot more than a job. It was his reason to get up in the morning and more importantly, his reason not to gangbang the night before. And the union he experienced with his coworkers was stronger than anything he had ever known in his gang and even in his family. So all we could do was surround him with love and the promise of rebuilding, and that's exactly what we did. I remember when the bakery existed there before the fire, our foreman was a guy named Roman, who was the biggest drug dealer I had ever known, and I knew them all. And Roman always resisted any offer to work there or be helped. In recovery, it says, it takes what it takes. It can be the birth of a friend, the birth of a son, the death of a friend. A long stretch in prison, I suspect it was the birth of Roman's daughter, Lisette. Anyway, he agreed to work there. And because he was a leader in his gang, he quickly became the foreman. So not only did he work with his enemies, he supervised them, which is a great deal more difficult. But he also had to greet the news crews and the tour groups and politicians and Prince Philip, and he had to do all that stuff. That was part of his job. He hated that part of the job. And so one day he and I are waiting for a busload of farmers from Central California who wanted to see the famous Homeboy Bakery. So we're waiting outside and he's having a bad attitude day. And the bus pulls up and I'm waving at it and I'm indicating where they can park in our parking lot. And it's a modern bus, one of those slick, sleek modern buses. And it has a microphone at the front of the bus where the tour guide speaks in. And so he pretends he's the tour guide. Welcome to Homeboy Bakery. Observe gang members in their natural habitat. Please keep your hands in the bus at all times. Do not attempt to feed the homies. They are not yet tame. And I turn to him and I say, cállate, cabrón. And so they get off the bus and I greet them and I hand them off to Roman. Well, I come back later on that afternoon and I see him and it triggers the memory of the tour group. I said, hey, how'd that tour group go? And he goes, damn, G, what's up with white people anyway? I said, I have no idea. What is up with us? He said, well, you know, check this out. They're always using the word great. I said, really? I didn't know that. He goes, yeah, this busload of gavachos, white people, they come off the bus and they walk into the bakery and all the machines are working and everything's clean. And said, wow, this place, it's great. And then they see homies, rivals, enemies working side by side. You fellas are great. And then they try our bread and they say, wow, this bread, it's great. He says, how come white people always be using the word great? And I said, I don't know. This is the first I've ever heard of that. And trust me when I tell you, every moment and opportunity I could find, I told him how great he was just to mess with him. Well, cut to like 6 months later, I show up near closing time at 11 o'clock at night. And Roman rushes me to my car, which he never does because he's hardly ever excited about anything. He goes, gee, you're not going to believe it. What happened yesterday? So he tells me that he goes to pick up his daughter, Lisette, who's 4 years old, and she's at the babysitter. And he drives her to their humble little apartment, whereas a single father, for the first time in his life, he's paying rent with honestly earned, clean, decent money. And he unlocks the front door and little Lisette runs down the hallway and she plants herself in the living room and she extends her arms and she takes the room in with her eyes and she announces, this is great. And Roman says, I thought she was turning white on me. And he gets down at eye level and he says, mijita, what's great? And little Lisette clutches her heart and she says, my home. And when she says this, Roman and I stare at each other with big tears in our eyes. And we stare at each other for what feels like an eternity until finally I break the silence as I watch tears run down his cheeks, as do mine. And I said, you did this. You've never had a home in your life, and now you have one. You did this. You used to be the biggest drug dealer in town, and you stopped and you baked bread instead. You did this. You've never had a father in your life, and now you are one. And I hate to have to tell you, but you're great. And I hate to have to tell you that the first time I ever retrieved that story from my memory bank was to tell it at his funeral to this packed church where his homies had asked me all the week preceding the funeral, what's the point of doing good if that can happen to you? I thought it was a good question, worthy of an answer. And I told that packed church that the point is that before Roman left us, he came to know the truth of who he was. He had received the tender glance, and he became that truth. He inhabited that truth, and no bullet can pierce it. No 4 prison walls can keep it out, and death can't touch it because it's huge. The Christmas carol, O Holy Night, says, long lay the world in sin and error pining till he appeared and the soul felt its worth. And yes, I suppose it's about Jesus. And yes, it's about Christmas, but how is it not the job description of people who receive the tender glance of God and want to be God in the world, compassionate, loving, and kind? You appear, and the soul feels its worth, and we all inhabit our common dignity and nobility. We see each other. Oh, nobly born. Remember who you really are, the Buddhists say. And the soul feels its worth. And together we shrink the spaces that separate us. Let me end with this. There was a homie named Danny who I knew only in the streets. He always had a gun tucked into the front of his pants. I knew him as a 13-year-old, a 15-year-old. He always vowed that he would never step foot at Homeboy Industries. I used to see him locked up, juvenile hall, probation camp. Finally, at 18, he went to prison, and he did a 2-year stretch. And he left prison, and it takes what it takes. For him, he returned home to a mother who had 6 months to live with pancreatic cancer. And he was the tender caregiver. He was the hospice point person, a family, a lot of siblings. And it was remarkable to watch him be so tender. Tenderness is the highest form of spiritual maturity. And Danny had accepted this. All the more remarkable because his mother had in fact tortured him when he was a child. And so I buried her, and a week later, he walked into Homeboy Industries for the first time. And I watched him work side by side with his enemies, guys he used to shoot at. I watched him, as the homies always say, laugh from the stomach, which was something new for him. I watched him get his GED and inhabit the truth of himself. He transformed his pain so he didn't have to inflict it anymore. And if his story had been a flame, you'd have to keep your distance, otherwise you'd get scorched. I would not have survived a single day of his childhood, and I stand in awe at what he had to carry rather than in judgment. So one day he came into my office and he was sitting there and he said, what happened to me yesterday has never happened to me in my life. And so he tells me that across the street at the end of the day, he got on the Gold Line heading east to go home. He said the train was packed, but he got a seat. And standing in front of him holding the pole was, he said, a medio pedo guy, a guy who was a little bit drunk. And Danny was wearing a sweatshirt that said, Homeboy Industries, jobs, not jails. And the little bit drunk guy looked at him and he said, "Hey, you work there?" And the drunk guy was a homie because he had tattoos, but Danny didn't know who he was and he didn't know whether he should engage him, but he just nods yes. And the drunk guy says, "Is it any good?" And Danny shrugs and he says, "It's helped me. In fact, I don't think I'm going to go back to prison because of this place." And so Danny stands and he reaches into his pocket and he pulls out a piece of paper and a pen and he writes Homeboy Industries address on the piece of paper. And he, as he's telling me the story, he says, "I couldn't believe I knew the address by heart." And he hands this piece of paper to the guy. And the guy studies it and Danny says, "Come see us. We'll help you." And the guy looks at Danny and he feels seen. And he says, "Thank you." And the next stop came. And the man got off and Danny sat down. And now Danny gets still and silent. And then he continues. What happened next has never happened to me in my life. Everyone on the train was staring at me. Everyone on the train was nodding at me. Everyone on the train was smiling at me. And now he can barely speak. And for the first time in my life, I felt admired. And the soul feels its worth. Oh, nobly born, remember who you really are. We receive the tender glance and we become that tender glance. And it is a lie, any talk of God that doesn't comfort us. And pretty soon, God's dream comes true. We shrink the spaces that separates us. A community of beloved belonging, where we all live in the same house. And it all happens at the margins. We imagine a community of kinship, and we imagine nobody standing outside of it, not widow, orphan, stranger, no one. And together in exquisite mutuality, we inhabit our dignity and our nobility. And pretty soon we cease to care whether anyone accuses us of wasting our time. For in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be seen again, heard again the voices that delight, the voices that haven't been heard before. And so we choose to make those voices heard. Thank you all.
Thank you, Father Greg. Thank you. I want to just say that was wonderful. It was more than great, more than great. We really appreciate you being here, and we've got a number of questions that people have prepared or prepared to ask today. So a couple things first. I think everyone's going to take something different from today. Some people are going to take a poignant story. Some people are going to, there's going to be something that's pierced their heart that you've said, that's made them laugh. Just one I'd like to point out to you that stuck with me is recently I watched a video of a mother who decided to take a frame and to frame her child's scribblings on the wall rather than wash them off. And she created a little gallery tag with the child's name on it and they named the piece of art. And I thought, what a way to reframe something we might see as a wholly different story. in the way that we've been taught. And this parent did something new. And so I really appreciate that. I'd also like to just, if you don't mind, before we start our question and answer, we had another couple groups. There's groups all over that have joined today. The Intersection Multicultural Center at UNLV, Psi Upsilon Omega, and the Collaboration Center of Las Vegas. So we were just really, really enthused that people wanted to hear your message, to be here with you. So thank you very much, and thank you to them for being here. And I think at some point, as you feel, if you think of anything to say, I know a lot of people have been curious of how Homeboys was affected, and how you see, or how you've seen responses to people in general this last year. The pandemic brought isolation for everyone, a sense of removal. And if you think that's moving us more to a compassionate place. So you don't need to answer that now, but if something comes up in you in that, I'd love to hear, and I think everyone else would. But our first question comes today from a student named Angeline, and she is joined by the CEO of a program here called CORE. And CORE is a community initiative that helps kids on the margins, kids that have some economic difficulties just with their education and their sense of empowerment in this world. And so I'd like to invite Lindsay to say a few words. And you may remember last year that I pointed out that there was someone who had said, if I'm near, I'll rush the stage and hug him. And she had to be out of town. Well, she's here this year, but again, far enough away that she can't rush the stage to hug you. Lindsay?
I knew you were going to bring that up, so I'm slightly embarrassed, but it is what it is, because it's very true. So CORE is an infrastructure for educational and life success. We work alongside historically underserved students and families to ensure economic mobility and that they can lead choice-filled lives. You know, CORE really aligns with your value and belief that no life out in the world should be valued above another. We are grateful to be here today and to be part of this conversation. And as Shauna mentioned, Father Boyle, you are one of my heroes, and I am in awe of your compassion and empathy. Thank you for the work that you do and your heart. It's now my honor to introduce Angeline, a CORE scholar, artist, and an incredible individual who sets the world on fire with her insight and her brilliance. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for the introduction. My name is Angeline, and the quote I will be using today is "Love and Light." I got this quote from a teacher who I had, and she passed away, and she used to say every day, love and light within people. Everybody just needs to find the love and light within them. My question for you is, do you find it difficult and exhausting to be compassionate all the time?
Yeah, I don't think it's about being compassionate so much as you choose to be joyful and you choose to cherish with every breath that you take. So compassion is sort of a byproduct of cherishing, and it's a byproduct of staying anchored in the present moment. So that's all you have is the present moment. So you try to delight in the people who are right in front of you. And so it's not so much a decision to be compassionate, but it will come as a result of your choosing to cherish. And that's where the joy is. And so once you find your true self in loving, compassion is just kind of, you know, what happens when you choose to cherish each other. And that's where the joy is. And then it becomes eternally replenishing. You never get exhausted from it. It doesn't deplete you ever, because it's the thing that keeps you alive. And once you have a dose of that, it's so compelling, you don't want anything else. But it's hard for us to find our way there, because it's you have to stay in the living room where the living happens. Otherwise, you're lamenting what happened yesterday. You're in the bathroom. or you're anxious about what's going to happen tomorrow, you're in the kitchen, you have to kind of stay anchored in the living room, and you have to stay living, right this moment. So none of us will live forever, but we all can choose to live in the forever. And the minute you land on that, you will discover what it is. So it's not a grim duty to be compassionate. But if you're, living and inhabiting in your true self in love, then that's all you need to do. So if love is your goal, failure doesn't exist, or disappointment, or discouragement, or even exhaustion doesn't exist. I mean, you can get tired, but if you're trying to be compassionate, then it's sort of about you, and it can't be about you. And it has to be about us. And as soon as it is, then it's eternally replenishing.
Wonderful. Our next question comes today from Betty Scott. She's a Stillpoint member, and she was a former teacher, quite a historian, and just a woman of wisdom.
Good morning, Father Greg. I'm so delighted to have you back again this year. Thank you for all the gifts that you've given us already. I spent most of my life very actively, as you are, in leadership with education, with spirituality, healthcare, etc. Your active life is committed to this dedication and overall vision of creating a compassionate world. I think you just answered my question wonderfully. So I'm going to just tell you what it was. And I think we can apply what you just said. I was going to ask you if you could please tell us how you support, ensure, guarantee that your own personal inner spiritual life, is attended to. But everything you said to me answered that question. What would be your point of view?
It's a good question. I think people are always wanting to stay vital, and I call it noticing the notice of God, and it doesn't always happen. It's a practice. You have to choose it every minute. You have to be attentive, and it's hard to do, not because we're selfish, but because we're distracted, and can be self-absorbed in our distraction. I had a homie come into my office the other day, Carlos, who's covered in tattoos, and I've known him a long time. I buried his father, who died of a heroin overdose. And he got up at the funeral 10 years ago and said, I've started using heroin because I wanted to know why my father loved it more than me. He's a guy who suffered a great deal. He's standing in front of my desk with a hairnet on and a mask and his apron from the bakery dusted with flour. And during the pandemic, I had helped fix his teeth. So he was standing in front of my desk and he said, "Can I take my mask off and show you my grill?" He was grateful. I said, "Sure." So he takes his mask off and a big Colgate smile and teeth aligned and white. And he's kind of exaggerating the smile to show off his dental work. And he says, "Not only did you pay for this smile, you are the reason I'm smiling." And before I can say anything, he says, "Hey, that's good. Write it down." And so I do. He redictates it to me and I write it down. And I think he was just hoping to get in my next book, and mission accomplished. But the two of us, we just laughed from the stomach. And this was a kid who many times in his life, I think, felt that he'd never laugh again. And he's a delight. And the day will never come when I have more courage, or I am more noble, or I'm closer to God than he is. And then suddenly you are noticing the notice of God, and we all come alive when that notice happens.
So Father Greg, our next question comes from us from Gar Jameson, and Gar Jameson is one of our Stillpoint trustees. He's a professor here locally, and just this week, an initiative that he's really helped push in Southern Nevada and led called Compassionate Las Vegas. Our city designated Las Vegas as a compassionate city. So Gar.
Father Greg, I want to thank you for your example, and I want to thank you for being here this morning. And I want to ask you a question, but before I do, I want to sort of tee it up. So yesterday I was in Reno with a group, and we were observing homelessness as it's exponentially growing, and I know it is in LA. I'm a part of a group called Hope Means Nevada. 1 in 10 of our teenagers attempt suicide. 1 in 4 have the ideation of suicide. I have a transgender daughter, MJ, who is not included and who experiences the violence of social media and the lack of compassionate acceptance. And then there's the racial injustice that we see on the planet, and the planet in climate degradation. So my question, my mentor, Karen Armstrong, asks, a compassionate community is an uncomfortable community. What makes you most uncomfortable about our planet in this moment?
I think in this moment we name things incorrectly, and that kind of causes discomfort for me. You know, Jesus himself saw the guy having a seizure, and he thought he was possessed by a demon, and he cured him, but he wasn't possessed by a demon. He had epilepsy. How we name things matters. I don't really believe in hate, you know, as something that's like part of the air quality. You know, nobody healthy, whole, integrated, balanced, well hates, never has. So when we want to address hate head on, it's because we've named it incorrectly. I know a university that after the Tree of Life, a synagogue shooting that was horrendous, this university started a seminar called Hate because they wanted to address hate head on. And I go, no, you'd make more progress if you called the seminar Health. How do we love each other into wholeness? A third of the military refuses to get a vaccine, and that's not because they know something Dr. Fauci doesn't know. It's because they're not well, they're not whole, they're not healthy, they're not integrated. They remain strangers to themselves. How do we love people into wholeness? I suspect that a third of the US Conference of Catholic Bishops will probably deny communion to Joe Biden. Well, that's not because of theology. That's because a third of them aren't well. They're not whole. They're strangers to themselves. And that's what that's about. A third of the country, according to Matthew Dowd, does not believe that all men and women are created equal. I think he's correct. But why? Because they're bad and wicked and evil? No, everybody's unshakably good. Everybody. But we're strangers to that goodness. And how do we love each other into wholeness? That frustrates me because we name things incorrectly. Nobody healthy has ever beat down an Asian American person on the streets of San Francisco. That's never happened. A healthy person has never done that. So address the fact that we're not well yet, that we're not whole, we're not healthy. Otherwise, it's all self-congratulatory. I stand against hate. I go, congratulations. Don't be surprised that we won't make any progress, because it's not about hate, it's about health. We belong to each other. Everybody is unshakably good. How do we love people into the wholeness of seeing their unshakable goodness? How we name things matters. There's a lot of bad diagnoses out there, and it's never led us to a healthy treatment plan. But one day it might. It's not demon possession, it's epilepsy. It matters.
Thank you for that answer. That was. Next up, we have, we're back to Cristo Rey, our friends from Cristo Rey, St. Viator. And I think Lelaine is going to offer a question, or it may be Brother Lamech. Well, I don't see them. So if we get them back, we'll invite them.
There they are.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we're here. I'm sorry.
No worries.
I guess my question is, what was your greatest achievement in Homeboy's industry? And if it's not too personal, what was your most devastating achievement in Homeboy industry?
Yeah, I agree with Mother Teresa, where she says we're not called to be successful. We're called to be faithful. I don't know what happened. You lost me. There I am. Yeah, I don't believe we're called to be successful. We're called to be faithful. So you embrace an approach that's good and true and right and just, and that's what you do. And then you have a light grasp on anything else: accomplishment, achievement, outcomes. I just don't care about those things. Disappointment doesn't exist, discouragement doesn't exist. If you stay anchored in the God who sustains you, and that you love as you have been loved, there's no such thing as success or accomplishment or achievement. But equally, there's no such thing as failure or discouragement or disappointment. Obviously there are things that are heartbreaking, when people you love are gunned down, often enough gunned down by people you love. And, that breaks your heart. But you want to find the thing that's more powerful than death and failure, and then hang on for dear life. A community of tenderness and beloved belonging, which is fostered at Homeboy Industries. Even death is afraid of that. So you want to stay anchored in that place where people are held and cherished. And this is a force more powerful than failure.
Thank you, Father Greg. Our next question comes from Michael Buckley. He's also a Stillpoint trustee, and you met him last year, and I believe you have something in common. You might share that.
We're both Cub alumni. Thanks, Father Greg. I mean, I'm kind of like Betty Scott. I think you probably have answered the question I had, but our board president, Mary Alice Nielsen, had us read a really interesting book called How to Lead When You Don't Know Where You're Going, Leading in Liminal Season. And I'm wondering, we certainly have been through a liminal season, a liminal year, and I wonder if you've had to ask yourself that question, but I think you've already answered it.
Well, no, it's a good question. I think this time oddly has, the more we've surrendered to it, I think the more it's enlightened us and awakened us to a new language. I think we were all fearful at the beginning as people were hoarding toilet paper and hand sanitizer that, oh my God, this is going to lead to a time of building higher walls. But instead, people built longer tables. And I was heartened by that. I find it kind of enlarged people's hearts where people could find room. I think it issued in a time of generosity, to say nothing of wanting to create anti-racist communities and to really find ourselves at the service of equity. So I find that it's been an interesting time, but part of it had to do with, you don't want grief to leave you where it found you. And we all had to grieve something. We all had to lose something during this time. And, identity and activity and community, things that you had to just sort of feel it and abide in it rather than flee it. So we had this grief and we leaned in and we were curious about it. And pretty soon, I think we were savoring it, and then we were relishing it. And then on the other side of that was joy. So I think there was a lesson learned in all this, a deep appreciation, I think, for each other and for relational wholeness that was kind of denied us. And yet it filled us with a sense of gratitude for what that means for us and how we long for it still. So there's a practice of curiosity that we have to embrace in our lives. So when a 100-year event happens, we're ready for it.
Beautiful. I think that pretty much answered the question I began with and said if something came to you about COVID and where maybe you saw compassion rising or lowering in the world, and I think you've answered that. Our final question today will come from Mary Alice Nielsen, and she's our board president. She's a co-founder of Stillpoint. She'll also lead us in a blessing to close out the day. And afterwards, and I don't know if you saw it, Father Greg, but after the completion of that, the artwork of the students created for this day will be shown again. And you may have heard, Father Greg, we showed him the wonderful video of Fabian. And I just yesterday noticed that Fabian got another accolade. He was just recognized for his art again in the community. And here's a beautiful piece that one of the kids created for today. I'd also like to mention two things before I turn it over to Mary Alice. Father Greg has a new book coming out. If you've read any of his other books, they're page turners. They'll have you laughing, crying, and really thinking about your place in this world and compassion and how we're called together. The first was Tattoos on the Heart. Second was Barking to the Choir, if I got them in the right order. And the third one coming out this fall is called The Whole Language, The Power of Extravagant Tenderness. So please be on the lookout for that. And I believe that just this week, Father Greg had a documentary coming out called Joyride. Am I right?
Apparently, yes. I think so.
Apparently, yes. So you worked on the documentary, but you're not on the PR side of putting it out there.
Yeah, I don't remember it much, but I guess they were around. Yeah.
Yeah, awesome.
I haven't seen it, so.
All righty. Well, thank you so much, Father Greg. And as I said, I'm going to turn it over to Mary Alice now. It's a pleasure to have you back a second time. Thank you.
Thank you, Shauna. So I do have one last question. There has been a lot happening in the world in addition to COVID. of course, in the political climate that we've experienced, and the amount of hate that's not hate, I guess. But there's been some discussion in groups about whether or not there really is an increased amount of violence, if there's an increased focus on it, or if there's just more awareness in our lives. And so I wonder what your take is on that.
Yeah, I have discovered in working with gang members for 37 years that gang violence is a language. It's not really so much a behavior. It's an indicator. It points beyond itself. So what undergirds gang violence is a lethal absence of hope. So it should surprise nobody that, gang violence is up 37% in Los Angeles. And why is that? Because we've been in 14 months of a 100-year event, a pandemic that has paralyzed hope and has denied people an ability to imagine tomorrow. So that has increased violence, but it's also increased hate crimes, and it's increased all the things that are born from despair, and it has exacerbated, the mental health issues that none of us want to address, because we want to stay anchored as human beings in moral outrage. And moral outrage comes when we presume that the starting place always is rational actors coming from a healthy place. And violence is never about a rational actor coming from a healthy place. Not Asian hate crime, not anti-Semitism, none of it is coming from rational actors in a healthy place. But if our starting point is people are unshakably good and they belong to us, then we don't demonize anybody, which is the opposite of how God sees, always, no exceptions. And so then we're anchored in the right place. But moralism has never kept us moral. It's only kept us from each other. And so the sooner we abandon moralism, and gang members have taught me this. I've never met a bad person. I've never met an evil person. That doesn't make me naive. That's just comes from seeing human beings and standing in awe of what folks have to carry. And if I were, moralistic about it, then I'm just severing belonging. These are people who don't belong to us. And that's where we need to stay anchored. Everyone is unshakably good. Demonizing is always untruth. And we belong to each other. I don't think we can go wrong. And I would add, as George Saunders, the writer, says, kindness is the only non-delusional response to everything, which is to say every other response is delusional. Our moral outrage, our self-righteousness, our wanting to address issues head on, instead of get underneath and find what the homies always call the thorn underneath. And kindness is the only non-delusional response to everything. So we would do well to be kind, be kind, be kind. That's all I got.
Thank you. If you would indulge us for one more question, there is Jane Franzioli, who is a member of our Stillpoint community, also has a question for you, and I'd like to ask her to join the screen.
Good morning, Father Boyle. I'm interested in your quote that we used on our website. God's desire to give us peace only awaits our willingness to cooperate with God's limitless magnanimity. So I Googled magnanimity, which, if you agree, is taking action in noble causes, a willingness to face danger, and a refusal to be petty. And as we know, historically, most of our religious leaders who have willingly participated with God's magnanimity, it hasn't always ended well for them, including you. You have faced danger. So I, as an average pilgrim, my greatest challenges would be to speak up in a crowd when I perceive an injustice, but because of my fear of being ostracized or excluded, I more often will choose to remain silent. So what would you say to rally someone like me to sacrifice? And also, what would I need to know when it's mine to speak up? Thank you.
Yeah, part of our time of the pandemic has been on endless Zooms, and we all know the experience of yelling at people on Zooms, unmute yourself, and yet I don't know if it's so much about speaking as it is about living as though the truth were true, so that people will see in you what it looks like to be kind and loving and compassionate. We're in an era when we want to win the argument. So I'm not so sure it's about speaking as so much witnessing. Be a witness to things, and you love people into their wholeness. You don't berate them into their wholeness. And there's a trap in everything, and mainly the thing to steer clear of is it can't be about me. And if I'm going to make some big pronouncement, am I making this about me? And, it's like I see injustice, so I speak out. Well, yeah, prisons really are how we practice exclusion. And so we want to create communities that practice inclusion. So it's a practice. You work at it and you do it rather than speak about it. So I'm kind of more in favor of being the place. The poet, and I'll end with this, the poet Wallace Stevens says, we live in the description of the place and not the place itself. So don't settle for the description of the place. Hold out for the place itself. Create the place itself, not surviving as the fittest, but thriving as the nurtured, a place where we hold each other and where cherishing is what engages every breath we take.
Thank you so very much. And I just received a text from Dr. Roisin Laughlin, who is joining us from Ireland, and she wanted to share her wishes with you, which I will in just a moment. But it was appropriate as she texted me and I read it and I responded back to her, that's great. And didn't really realize that until I'd written that. But she wanted to share her greetings from Ireland and thank you for your modeling the very health and wholeness that you speak about. And you're a tremendously charismatic speaker and human being. So those words are from Roisin. And I want to add our thanks from all of the Stillpoint community to you, Father Greg, and for being an inspiration in times of difficulty and challenges, and most importantly, providing us with hope and marching orders to be kind and to love. And before we close, as we do many of and most of our programs and meetings at Stillpoint, we just want to take a moment of silence and gather into our heart. And if you would, the participants would just take a breath and lower your eyes. And just take a moment and feel your heart. And one of the programs that we have regularly at Stillpoint, our Thursday night meditations. And one of our favorite meditation providers is Imam Jamal, who is one of the Interfaith Amigos. And he always reminds us to feel the love in our heart. And so as you take a breath in and exhale, if you will think of somebody who has shown you love, who has spoken a kind word to you, and just for a moment, hold them in your heart. And as has been spoken of today, the love that we have for ourselves and the kindness with which we treat ourselves reflects out to the communities, to our families, and to our loved ones. And most importantly, reflects on everyone we meet. So just for a moment, hold yourself in love. And we send out gratitude to Father Greg and to all the homies. And gratitude to Shauna and her team for bringing us these inspirational words today. And may we always continue to love others without inquiring whether or not they are worthy of love. And we offer up all of our being to the divine, to the Holy Spirit. And may we go forth in hope. So I thank you, and I invite you to, if you did not have an opportunity to see the art that was displayed beforehand, I please ask you to view it as beautiful, inspirational, and a gift. So thank you, Shauna. Thank you, Father Greg.